The heavy oak door to my private studio usually guards a silence so absolute it feels like a physical weight, a barrier against the chaos of the city. But tonight, that silence had a different texture. I stopped on the threshold, my hand still gripping the cold brass handle. There, sitting on the velvet chaise I kept for reading, was Elena. Elena, the woman who handled 16th century vellum with the precision of a diamond cutter, was currently slumped against the cushions, eyes closed, hands loose in her lap. The air smelled of dust and binding glue, but underneath, I caught the faint, distinct scent of her. Something like cold rain and expensive soap. She shouldn't be here. She certainly shouldn't be waiting here. But looking at the unguarded line of her throat, I realized I had no intention of asking her to leave. To understand why this moment felt like a tectonic shift, you have to understand Elena's reputation. In the rarefied, dust-choked world of archival restoration, she is a myth. They call her the surgeon of history. I've seen her take a manuscript that looked like a pile of charred leaves and coax it back into a legible text with nothing but moisture, patience, and a terrifying amount of skill. She doesn't just fix books, she resurrects them. I am merely the custodian. I own the collection, I sign the insurance checks, and I provide the space. My role is structure. Hers is salvation. Usually, our dynamic is defined by a rigid, professional geometry. She arrives at 8 sharp, her hair pulled back in a severe knot that suggests no strand would dare fall out of place without a written permit. She wears white cotton gloves like a second skin. In the public eye, at symposiums or museum galas, she is untouchable. She speaks in complete paragraphs, dissecting binding techniques with a cool academic detachment that makes grown men stammer. But here, in the controlled twilight of my studio, I see the toll that perfection extracts. The studio is designed for preservation. The windows are UV treated, casting the room in a permanent amber-hued dusk. The humidity is kept at a constant 45%. It is a bunker for fragile things. It smells of wheat starch paste, aged leather, and the sweet vanilla decay of lignin. It is a place where time is suspended by design. For the last 3 months, it has been our shared universe. She works at the large drafting table under a magnifying lamp, and I sit at my desk, ostensibly managing the estate, but mostly watching the precise hypnotic movements of her hands. There is an intimacy to watching someone work this closely. I know the specific furrow of her brow when she encounters a stubborn adhesive stain. I know she holds her breath when she is lifting a page that has been fused to another for 300 years. We rarely speak during these hours. The silence is a tool, as necessary as her bone folders and micro spatulas. It's a communion built on a shared reverence for things that can be destroyed by a careless touch. But recently, the geometry is warped. The professional lines are blurring, not through words, but through presence. It started subtly. She began arriving 20 minutes early, before the coffee was even brewed. Then she started lingering after her tools were packed away. At first, I thought she was double-checking her work, driven by that relentless perfectionism. But she wasn't working. She was just standing by the window, watching the dust motes dance in the filtration system's current. Last week, she didn't even go to the table immediately. She walked in, dropped her heavy leather satchel on the floor, a sound that seemed shockingly loud in the quiet room, and just stood there, breathing. It wasn't the measured breath of the professional centering herself. It was the ragged inhale of someone who had been holding their breath for miles. She looked at me then, her gaze stripping away the client-contractor barrier for a split second. It was a look of raw exhaustion, a silent admission that the noise of the world outside the heavy steel door was becoming unbearable. She wasn't just coming here to restore my first edition of Paradise Lost. She was coming here because this room, with its thick walls and filtered air, was a vacuum for the chaos in her mind. She was treating my studio like a decompression chamber. And tonight, finding her asleep on my chaise, defenses completely dismantled, confirmed it. The architect of preservation was falling apart, and she had chosen my sanctuary as the place to let the pieces land. I walked further into the room, the floorboards settling under my weight, and the sound made her stir. The shift in the air was immediate, charged, heavy, and undeniable. To fully grasp the magnitude of her surrender in my studio, you must first witness the armor she wears, and the violence required to maintain it when the world is watching. 2 nights before I found her asleep, we attended the preview for the Kensington sale. The gallery was a sensory minefield. It was overly bright, filled with the sharp clinking of champagne flutes and the droning buzz of performative intellect. Walking through the center of it, Elena was a weapon. She wore her professional reputation like a suit of armor, matched only by the tailoring she adopted for these events. In the studio, she favored soft knits. Here, she was encased in structured charcoal wool, buttoned tight to the throat, the lines of her blazer sharp enough to cut glass. Her hair was pulled back so tight it pulled the skin at her temples taut. She moved through the crowd with a lethal economy of motion, assessing manuscripts not as art, but as targets. I watched her approach a display case where a rival collector, a man named Sterling who treated books like trophies, was holding court over a 12th century illuminated psalter. Sterling was pontificating about the gold leaf, his voice booming with unearned confidence. Elena didn't interrupt. She simply waited, her silence acting as a vacuum that sucked the air out of his monologue. When he finally paused, she stepped into the gap. She didn't look at him. She looked at the book. "The blue pigment," she said, her voice low but carrying a frequency that cut through the room's chatter. "It's Prussian blue. Chemically impossible before 1704. The illumination is a 19th century forgery." It was an absolute, undeniable fact. Sterling sputtered, turning a mottled shade of red, but Elena had already moved on. She dismantled his ego with the same clinical detachment she used to remove rusted staples. I followed in her wake, mesmerized by the brutality of her competence. But it was the sound of her work that anchored me. In the gallery, she wore fresh, white cotton gloves. The friction of that fabric against the heavy catalog paper became a rhythmic snare drum in the cacophony of the room. Snap, slide, turn. It was a precise, tactile sound that signaled her judgment. Every time she turned a page, I felt the sensation ghost across my own palms. I watched her handle a $1 million folio with a terrifying casualness, her gloved hands moving with a speed that blurred the edges of the paper. To the room, she was a machine. To me, she was a storm contained in a glass bottle. The crowd swelled, pushing us together near the back. Standing inches behind her, I felt a different kind of temperature. The heat radiating off her was intense, a physical force field of high-functioning anxiety. I stepped closer, placing my body between her and the jostling crowd, creating a pocket of dead space around her. I was close enough to smell the sharp, metallic tang of the ozone on her coat, layered over that personal scent of rain and skin. I looked down at the nape of her neck, exposed by the severity of her updo. The tiny, fine hairs there were trembling. She wasn't made of ice. She was holding herself together with a tension that threatened to snap. She must have felt my gaze, or perhaps just the weight of my protection, because she turned. For a second, the gallery dissolved. She looked at me, her eyes wide and dark, stripping away the arrogance she had just used to eviscerate Sterling. In that glance, there was no performance. There was only a shared, silent confession. She was telling me that she was drowning in the noise, and I was the only one who could see the water rising. We were effectively alone in the room. The transition back to the studio was seamless, yet absolute. The auction house had been a performance of armor and sharp edges. This was the soft, vulnerable underbelly of reality. The late-night sessions ceased to be an exception and solidified into our ritual. The studio, with its amber light and filtered air, became a capsule where time didn't just slow down, it stopped completely. The only clock that mattered was the rhythm of her work, a cadence that dictated the beating of my own heart. That rhythm was anchored by a single, specific sound, the friction of white cotton gloves against rag paper. Shh, slide, press. It was a soft, dry sound, like a secret being whispered directly into the ear. But in the absolute, heavy silence of the room, it was hypnotic. I would sit at my desk, a ledger open but unread, and just listen. It was a tactile percussion that I felt in my own fingertips. I could hear the difference between the confident sweep of her hand over a sturdy vellum binding and the delicate, terrified caution she used for brittle newsprint. The sound became a tether, pulling my attention away from my own work and fastening it irrevocably to her hands. One night, when the rain was lashing against the darkened windows, she broke the silence. She didn't look up from the table. She was using a bone folder to smooth a crease, her movements repetitive and soothing. "It's called body doubling," she murmured. Her voice was low, blending with the storm outside, stripped of her usual academic polish. "I can't do this, the deep work, when I'm alone. My brain needs an anchor." She paused, lifting the tool to inspect the edge of the page. "When it's just me, the silence gets too loud. It fills up with static. But when you're here, just sitting there, breathing, turning your own pages, it regulates the room. You're the gravity." I didn't speak. I didn't want to fracture the moment with words that would fall short. The admission shifted the ground beneath us. I wasn't just the client paying the invoices. I was a necessary component of the restoration. I stopped pretending to work, watching her with an open, illicit intensity. I learned the topography of her focus, seeing the tension accumulate in the muscles of her neck, a physical knot of anxiety that I found myself aching to smooth away. She was currently working on a 17th century medical text, a victim of water damage from a century ago. It was a swollen, warped block of history, the pages fused together by mold and neglect. It was a broken thing. Watching her with it was a lesson in tenderness. She didn't force the pages apart. She introduced moisture, slipping a humidified spatula between the layers, coaxing the fibers to relax. She was teaching the paper to trust her. The metaphor was heavy in the room, hanging in the air like the scent of the wheat paste she used. She was taking something that had been hardened by trauma and showing it how to be soft again. The atmosphere in the studio began to thicken. It wasn't just the humidity control. It was the density of the unsaid. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was viscous, charged with the hyper-awareness of two bodies sharing a locked space. When she stood up to stretch, arching her back and exposing the pale line of her throat, the sound of my own pen scratching against paper seemed deafeningly loud. The air felt pressurized, as if the room itself was holding its breath. We were alone, insulated by steel doors and stone walls, and the professional distance between us was evaporating, replaced by a magnetic, terrifying pull. The friction of her gloves wasn't just smoothing paper anymore. It felt like it was wearing down the last of my defenses, leaving me raw and waiting. The sanctuary of the studio is a controlled vacuum, a place where entropy is held at bay by humidity monitors and filtration systems. But to restore a thing, you eventually have to leave the preservation tank and hunt for the raw materials of its resurrection. We ventured out into the city on a Tuesday, seeking a specialist bookbinder's supply shop, tucked away in a cobblestone alley that time seemed to have forgotten. Stepping through the door was like walking into the inside of a very old, very well-loved pocket. The air here was thick, heavy with the visceral, organic sense of the trade. It didn't smell like the sterile preservation of my studio. It smelled of life and labor. The pungent, earthy aroma of animal hide tanned with oak bark clashed with the sweet, cloying scent of beeswax and the sharp tang of rabbit skin glue. It was a sensory assault, a cluttered, dusty labyrinth of shelves stacked floor to ceiling with the building blocks of history. For the first time since I'd met her, Elena wasn't wearing her white cotton gloves. That absence felt shockingly intimate, like seeing a Victorian lady undo her corset in public. Her hands, usually shrouded and anonymous, were suddenly bare, pale, and terrifyingly dexterous. I watched her move down the narrow aisle of leathers, her fingertips grazing the rolls of skin. She touched a swatch of crimson goatskin, testing the grain, her thumb circling a small imperfection in the hide. The motion was slow, deliberate, and entirely sensual. She wasn't just checking for quality, she was communicating with the material, asking it if it was worthy of the 17th century text waiting on her table. I followed her, mesmerized by this new, tactile version of the woman I thought I knew. In the studio, she was a surgeon. Here, she was an artist, facing the terror of the blank canvas. The sheer volume of choice was beginning to weigh on her. I saw the familiar tension creep into her shoulders as she stared at a wall of linen threads, each spool a slightly different shade of cream, bone, and antique white. To me, they were identical. To her, the wrong choice was a desecration. She reached for a spool of unwaxed linen thread at the exact moment I did. It was an accident of proximity in the cramped aisle. My hand closed over hers, my palm pressing against the back of her fingers. The contact was brief, lasting no more than a second, but the reaction was disproportionate to the event. A jolt of electricity, sharp and hot, arced up my arm. It wasn't just static from the carpet. It was the sudden, violent alignment of two magnetic fields that had been dancing around each other for weeks. She froze. She didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, she let my hand cover hers, trapping her fingers against the spool. The air in the dusty shop charged, the smell of beeswax suddenly overwhelming. I looked at her profile. She was staring at the thread, her breath hitched in her throat. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hand, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear with a trembling finger. "It's too much," she whispered, her voice tight. She wasn't talking about the thread. She gestured vaguely at the shelves, her eyes wide and glassy. "The grain of the goatskin is too coarse for the era. The gold leaf. If I get the carat count wrong, the oxidation will destroy the aesthetic in 50 years. I'm trying to save it, but every choice feels like a trap door." She was spiraling. The perfectionism that made her a genius was currently eating her alive. She was paralyzed by the possibility of error, drowning in the nuances of texture and tone. She looked at me, and the vulnerability in her expression was devastating. She needed structure. She needed someone to close the infinite doors of possibility and leave only one open. I stepped closer, invading her personal space, using my body to block out the chaotic shelves behind her. I reached past her shoulder, the wool of my coat brushing against her arm, and plucked a spool of thread from the rack. I didn't hesitate. I didn't compare. I simply chose. "This one," I said, my voice low and absolute. I placed the spool in her hands, closing her fingers around it. "It matches the binding of the 1640 folio perfectly. You don't need to look at the others." She looked down at the thread, then up at me. The panic in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a wash of relief so profound it looked like exhaustion. She exhaled, her shoulders dropping 3 inches. I had taken the weight of the decision from her, and in doing so, I had become the architect of her peace. She nodded, gripping the spool like a lifeline. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay." If the studio is the operating theater where history is saved, the deep storage vault is the cryostatic chamber where it waits to be woken. Located 3 stories beneath the foundation of the house, it was originally built as a panic room during the Cold War, a fact that seems charmingly obsolete until the heavy steel door seals with a thud that vibrates through the soles of your shoes. Now it is a climate-controlled fortress, a subterranean library of high-density rolling stacks and temperature monitors that hum with a low, menacing efficiency. We went down there on a Thursday, seeking a specific binding reference from a 15th century ledger that I kept in the furthest bank of shelves. The transition from the living world to the vault is violent. The air down here is kept at a permanent, shivering 60 degrees to prevent mold spores from blooming on the vellum. It is a dry, aggressive cold that sinks immediately through layers of clothing and settles into the marrow. Elena shivered as we entered, pulling her cardigan tighter around her frame. The motion sensors flickered to life, bathing the concrete aisle in a clinical, blue-white wash of light that made her skin look like porcelain. We were surrounded by thousands of voices, all bound in leather and silence, stacked floor to ceiling in rows that stretched back into the shadows. "Row 4, I said, my voice sounding flat and dampened by the sheer density of the paper surrounding us. The Venetian collection. The aisle was narrow, designed for the solitary scholar, not for 2 people navigating the charged geometry of a developing obsession. I walked ahead, turning the heavy crank to separate the rolling stacks. The gears groaned, a sound of heavy metal grinding against metal, before the shelves parted to reveal the section we needed. The ledger was on the bottom shelf. I crouched down to retrieve it, but the spine was obscured by a misaligned folio next to it. As I reached out, Elena moved. She didn't wait for me to stand or step aside. She stepped into the narrow gap behind me, her intent focused entirely on the books. The space was impossibly tight. To see the shelf, she had to lean over me, bracing one hand on the metal upright of the shelving unit. I froze. I was trapped between the history of the world and the heat of her body. I could feel the warmth radiating from her legs, inches from my back. She leaned closer, peering into the gloom of the lower shelf. And that was when I felt it, the ghost of her breath against the sensitive skin of my nape. It was a shock of warmth in the freezing room, a rhythmic, intimate caress that made the hair on my arm stand up. She wasn't touching me, not technically, but the proximity was suffocating in the best way. I could smell the soap on her skin, amplified by the cold air, mixing with the scent of old dust and iron. "It's here," she whispered. Her voice vibrated against my spine. She didn't move away. She stayed there, hovering in my personal space, creating a canopy of tension. "The silence down here," she said, her breath hitting my neck again. "It's different than the studio. Darker." I turned slowly, still crouched, until I was looking up at her. She was looking down, her eyes dark and unreadable in the harsh light. "It's isolated," I managed to say. "Nothing gets in." "Exactly," she murmured. "No signal, no noise, just the cold." I stood up. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding. The aisle was so narrow that my standing forced her to step back, her back hitting the opposing shelf. We were chest to chest now, the ledger forgotten on the floor. The cold of the vault seemed to recede, pushed back by the sudden, searing heat between us. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes. It was a question asked without words, a terrifying invitation. I leaned in. The distance between us collapsed to a single trembling inch. I could see the dilation of her pupils, the erratic pulse fluttering in her throat. I was going to kiss her. I was going to ruin everything and save us both. Then, with a mechanical roar that sounded like a jet engine, the ventilation system kicked into its purge cycle. The noise shattered the moment instantly. The spell broke. Elena flinched, the vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of shock. She stepped sideways, breathless and flushed, while the fans screamed around us, recycling the air we had almost shared. The equilibrium we had established, delicate as a spider web stretched across a doorframe, finally snapped on a Tuesday. It wasn't a gradual decline into chaos. It was a sudden, violent rupture, triggered by the world outside our walls. The catalyst was a deadline from the National Archives, a sudden acceleration of a project involving a water-damaged constitution that had supposedly been stable. They moved the delivery date up by 3 weeks. For a normal person, this is a scheduling conflict. For Elena, whose entire existence is predicated on the control of variables, it was a catastrophic system failure. She didn't arrive at the studio. She invaded it. The heavy door flew open with a force that rattled the frames of the sketches on the wall. She stormed in, bringing a swirl of chaotic energy into the amber twilight of the room. She was soaked, her coat dark with rain, her hair escaping its pins in wild, damp tendrils that plastered against her neck. She didn't greet me. She didn't even look at me. She went straight to her table, her movements jerky and discordant, lacking that fluid, underwater grace I had come to memorize. I watched from my desk, the pen freezing in my hand. The air in the room, usually a slow-moving current of dust and peace, suddenly felt jagged. I saw the tension running through her frame as she stripped off her coat and threw it, onto the floor. She was muttering to herself, a rapid-fire stream of technical specifications and curse words, a litany of disaster. She pulled on her gloves, but the cotton snagged on her damp skin. She ripped them off, throwing them into the waste bin, and grabbed a fresh pair, her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps that sounded like tearing paper. "I can fix the binding," she said to the empty room, her voice brittle. "I just need to stabilize the pH. If I can stabilize the pH, the ink won't bleed. It won't bleed." She sat down, grabbing a scalpel with a ferocity that was terrifying. She wasn't approaching the work with reverence today. She was attacking it. She pulled the magnifying lamp down, the harsh light bleaching the color from her face. I saw her hand hover over the manuscript. Not my book, but the disaster she had brought with her. And then I saw it. The tremor. Her right hand, usually steady enough to perform surgery on a butterfly wing, was shaking. It was a fine, high-frequency vibration that traveled from her wrist to the tip of the blade. She tried to steady it, gripping her own wrist with her other hand, but the shake persisted. It was the physical manifestation of a mind that had redlined and blown a gasket. She let out a sound, a frustrated, strangled cry, and the scalpel clattered onto the table, bouncing once before coming to rest against the spine of the book. She stared at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "Stop it," she hissed at her own fingers. "Just stop." She was going to break something. If not the book, then herself. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floorboards, a loud, deliberate sound that cut through her panic loop. I didn't rush. I moved with the heavy, inexorable momentum of a storm front. I walked past her table to the main door. I turned the deadbolt. Thunk. Then I engaged the secondary security lock. Click. The sounds were final, sealing the studio off from the National Archives, the rain, and the expectations of the world. Then I walked to the wall panel and killed the overhead lights. The room plunged into darkness, save for the single, focused beam of her magnifying lamp and the soft ambient glow from the humidity monitors. The sudden drop in sensory input was like a physical blow. Elena gasped, her head snapping up. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice high and thin. "I have to work. The pH levels." "You aren't working," I said. My voice was low, pitched to resonate in the sudden quiet. I walked to her table. I didn't ask for permission. I reached into the circle of harsh light and turned off her lamp. Now we were in true shadow. The only light came from the city bleeding through the heavy curtains. "You're crashing, Elena." I moved around the table until I was standing next to her chair. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, the pupils blown so large they swallowed the iris. She looked terrified, not of me, but of the silence I had just enforced. She was stripped bare, the armor of the professional completely gone, leaving only the woman who was vibrating apart. "I can't stop," she whispered, and the desperation in her voice cracked my heart open. "The noise, it's so loud out there. It's screaming. I came here because..." She trailed off, her hands twisting in her lap, fighting the urge to pick up the tool again. "I came here because I needed you to make it stop." I didn't offer empty platitudes. I didn't tell her it would be okay. In restoration, you don't paint over the damage. You stabilize the foundation. I walked to the small kitchenette in the corner, the sound of my footsteps heavy and deliberate on the floorboards. I poured a glass of water from the carafe. The ice clinked against the crystal, a sharp, real sound in the velvet darkness. I brought it to her. "Drink," I said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction designed to override the panic loop in her brain. She took the glass. Her hands were trembling so violently that water sloshed over the rim, cold and shocking against her skin. She drank, gulping it down like someone who had been lost in a desert. I took the empty glass from her and set it aside, far out of reach of the manuscript. Then I did the one thing the professional contract forbade. I breached the perimeter. I pulled my chair around the table. The scrape of wood on wood was loud, aggressive. I sat directly in front of her, our knees almost brushing. In the dark, the smell of the studio, that dry, dusty scent of old paper, faded into the background. In its place, the air filled with her. It was that complex, neurotic scent of jasmine, rain, and the metallic tang of pure adrenaline. It was the smell of a storm breaking. "Elena," I said. I pitched my voice low, dropping it into that chest-deep register that seemed to be the only frequency she could hear over the static. "Look at me. Not the book. Just me." She lifted her head. Her face was pale, stripped of the academic arrogance she wore like a shield at the auction house. Her eyes were vast, dark pools of panic, searching for something solid to grab onto. It was an unflinching gaze, raw and terrifyingly open. She wasn't looking at a client. She was looking at the only stationary object in a spinning room. Her hands were still in her lap, twisting together, the knuckles white. The vibration hadn't stopped. She was still shaking apart. I can't find the edge, she whispered, her voice cracking. It's all noise. I can't find the silence. I have it, I said. I'm holding it for you. I reached out. I didn't ask. I took both of her hands in mine. Her skin was ice cold, clammy with the sweat of the crash. My hands were warm, steady. I didn't just hold them, I anchored them. I applied firm, steady pressure, squeezing tight enough to be felt through the numbness of her shock. I forced her hands still with the weight of my own. The effect was instantaneous. She gasped, a sharp intake of air that sounded like a sob. The connection was electric, not the static shock of the supply shop, but a deep, grounding current. I felt the tremor in her bones travel into my palms, and I absorbed it. I held her fast. Feel that? I murmured, my thumbs pressing into the pulse points of her wrists. That's the ground. You aren't falling. She stared at our joined hands. The shaking began to subside, dampened by my grip. Her shoulders dropped, the rigid tension dissolving as she slumped forward, seeking the gravity I was providing. Why? She breathed, looking up at me again. Why is it only quiet here? Because out there, you have to be the architect, I told her. Here, I am the structure. You just have to exist. She closed her eyes, leaning her forehead forward until it almost touched my chin. I can't breathe out there, she confessed, the words vibrating against my skin. The air is too thin. It's too loud. I try to go home, but my apartment echoes. I try to work, but my hands... She shuddered. I can only breathe here, with you. It was a terrifying admission. She was telling me that I wasn't just a part of her workflow. I was her life support. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just the custodian of the books anymore. I was the keeper of the restorer. The trembling stopped. It didn't taper off gradually. It ceased with the sudden, absolute finality of a machine being cut from its power source. But the stillness that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, loaded with a kinetic potential that made the air between us feel thick enough to bruise. The dynamic in the room shifted violently. A moment ago, I had been the anchor, holding a ship against a storm. Now, the storm had passed, and we were just two people alone in the dark, hands locked together, breathing the same recycled air. The medical necessity of the touch evaporated, replaced by something far more dangerous. My grip on her hands changed. I wasn't holding her together anymore. I was just holding her. My thumbs, which had been pressing into her pulse points to monitor her heart rate, began to move. It was an instinctive, treacherous shift. I traced the delicate architecture of her metacarpals, the fine bones that did such impossible work, moving with a slow, deliberate caress that had no place in a professional relationship. Elena didn't pull away. She didn't reclaim her hands or retreat into the safety of her role as the restorer. Instead, she leaned into the contact. She turned her hands within mine, lacing our fingers together until our palms were flush, a seal of heat and friction that felt more intimate than nudity. She lifted her head, and the look on her face stole the breath from my lungs. The panic was gone, burned away by the crash, leaving her expression raw, unguarded, and terrifyingly open. Her pupils were still blown wide, swallowing the iris, but they weren't searching for safety anymore. They were fixed on my mouth. The silence of the studio, usually a passive backdrop, became an amplifier. I could hear the rustle of her silk blouse as her chest rose and fell. I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. The darkness around us felt velvet and close, pushing us together, erasing the rest of the room until the only reality was the heat radiating from her skin. You spend your entire life saving things, I whispered. My voice sounded rough, strange to my own ears. I released one of her hands, but only so I could reach up. My fingers grazed the line of her jaw, feeling the tension still locked in the muscle there. Her skin was incredibly soft, a shocking contrast to the steel will she projected to the world. You treat every scrap of paper, every broken binding like it's holy. You pour yourself into them until you're empty. She leaned into my hand, closing her eyes for a second, her cheek pressing against my palm. She let out a shaky exhale that ghosted across my wrist. It's my job, she murmured. It's not a job. It's a penance, I corrected, my thumb brushing over her cheekbone. You look at these books like they are the only things in the world that deserve to be preserved. I tilted her face up, forcing her to look at me again. But you're wrong, Elena. You are the masterpiece here. You are the only thing in this room I'm interested in saving. The admission hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. I saw the words land. Her breath hitched. The last wall between us shattered. She looked at me with a mixture of wonder and desperate hunger, as if I had just spoken a language she had been trying to decode her entire life. Then save me, she whispered. I didn't hesitate. I leaned in, closing the agonizing distance between us. The kiss wasn't tentative. It wasn't a question. It was a collision of precision and desperate relief. It started slow, a deliberate reading of intentions, testing the weight of the moment. Her lips were soft, tasting of the cold water I had given her and the salt of unshed tears. But then the restraint broke. She made a low sound in her throat, a sound of pure want, and the kiss deepened, becoming urgent, consuming. It was a release of weeks of pressure. It was the friction of the gloves, the heat of the vault, the silence of the library, all culminating in this single physical point of contact. She tasted like a storm. She tasted like the only thing that was real. Her hands, which had been passive in mine, suddenly came alive. She gripped the lapels of my shirt, pulling me closer, anchoring herself to me with a strength that belied her earlier fragility. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her out of the chair and into the space between my knees, gathering her against me. The sensation was overwhelming. The feel of her body pressing against mine, the scent of jasmine and old paper filling my senses, the absolute surrender in the way she melted into my hold. She stopped fighting the world. She stopped trying to hold up the ceiling. She simply let go, collapsing into the structure I provided, letting me carry the weight of her existence for a while. In the dark sanctuary of the studio, with the rain beating against the glass, she finally surrendered. The dawn didn't bring the harsh, corrective light of regret. It brought a new, integrated reality, illuminating the studio with a clarity that made the previous months of professional distance seem like a performance we had both tired of acting out. We didn't speak about what had happened. We didn't need to negotiate the terms of this new treaty. The shift was organic, absolute, and terrified of nothing. The studio ceased to be merely a laboratory for the preservation of paper and ink. It became the habitat of something living, a shared territory where the air was permanently charged with the static of our proximity. Our routine has evolved into a seamless, intimate choreography. The rigid geometry of client and contractor has dissolved. Now, when she works at the drafting table, the silence that fills the room isn't a barrier. It is a conductive medium. I no longer sit at my desk pretending to read ledgers. I sit in the velvet chair, close enough to hear the soft exhale of her breath when she successfully lifts a stain from a page. The dynamic has transformed into a necessary fusion. She works better, not just because I am there, but because I am with her. There are moments now, in the heavy amber twilight of the afternoon, where the work stops. She will lay down her bone folder, strip off the white cotton gloves that serve as her professional skin, and simply reach for me. She doesn't need to ask for the regulator anymore. She knows where it is. I take her hands, those brilliant, tremor-prone hands, and I hold them. The contact is grounding, a recalibration of her nervous system against mine. We exist in these quiet interludes, suspended between the tick of the humidity monitor and the beat of our own pulses. The friction of the gloves is no longer just a sound of industry. It is the prelude to the touch of her skin. She no longer waits for permission to enter the sanctuary. The hesitation at the threshold is gone. She has the security code. She has the key to the heavy oak door. She enters the studio as if she is stepping into her own skin, leaving her coat on my chair, her scent of jasmine and rain claiming the space as thoroughly as any deed of ownership. The intruder has become the inhabitant. The sanctuary is no longer mine. It is ours. This integration has bled out from the studio, seeping into the cold, sharp-edged world outside. We still attend auctions. We still walk through the hushed, judgmental halls of galleries. But the dynamic has shifted. We move through the crowds like a single entity, tethered by an invisible, unbreakable line. When the noise of the cocktail parties rises to a fever pitch, when the static threatens to overwhelm her, she doesn't need to flee. She just catches my eye. Across the room, over the rim of a champagne flute, I hold her gaze. I project the silence of the studio to her, a private signal that cuts through the interference. I see her shoulders drop. I see the panic recede. We carry the quiet with us now, a portable fortress that we can deploy anywhere. I used to believe that the value of my collection lay in its rarity, in the first editions, the illuminated manuscripts, the history bound in leather. I spent years building a fortress to protect dead things. I was wrong. Watching her now, bent over a folio, her face soft in the lamplight, I realized the truth. The collection is just paper. The woman restoring it, the woman who trusts me with her chaos, who lets me be the anchor for her brilliance, is the only treasure in the room, worth dying to preserve. The sound of a page turning is no longer just a noise. It is the heartbeat of our life. The door clicks shut, sealing us in. She is at her bench, steady and brilliant, and I am at the door, the keeper of the quiet. The world is loud, but in here, we breathe. If you understand the necessity of finding a sanctuary in the chaos, subscribe for more stories. The lock is engaged.